particular topic on school textbooks or school curricula from a post-humanist perspective. So in this particular talk, I will divide my discussion into two sections. In the first part, I will briefly explain what posthumanism is as a philosophy, as a theoretical framework in applied linguistics and social sciences. And in the later part, I will discuss my own study, which has been conducted in the province of Sindh in collaboration with two other researchers. So I begin my conversation with the uh, words of Michel Foucault, a French philosopher, who actually writes in his book, The Order of Things, about man as a recent invention and perhaps one nearing its end. So what does Foucault actually mean by these words? Foucault basically talks about the development of human and social sciences since the Enlightenment period through modernity in the 20th century, where man assumed a central position in the knowledge production. This is where the post-humanist thought actually intervenes to question the centrality of the man and help us to redefine the human and its relation with the non-human entities. Basically, it questions the idea of the man as a monarch of being, basically. So, what is posthumanism? Though it requires a lot of time to discuss its philosophical underpinnings. I will just give you a brief overview of this philosophy. And basically, it's a wider on epistemological projects, and it deals with a number of concerns, a number of questions. For example, in the first place, it questioned the idea of the human exceptionalism. So the idea of human exceptionalism is something where human is actually considered to be the primary creature, or human consider himself at the center of the entire world, like monarch of being, as I said earlier. So, and therefore, the relationship of the human with the non-human world, non-human material in the physical world, is basically defined in terms of human-centeredness. And secondly, posthumanism basically re-evaluates the role of objects in space in relation to human thought and action. So objects in space, they are not only there to be considered as passive or to be studied by the human beings, but they are very active and they contribute to developing human thinking, and they also influence our human actions, and likewise human actions and thought, they also influence different objects and spaces. So thirdly, we basically talk about in posthumanism, we talk about the human thinking, enhancement of human thinking and capacity through various AI technologies, and this is where we have idea of this cyborg, for example, the transhumanism. So basically, posthumanism tries to look at the reality, look at the world in terms of assemblages, in terms of entanglements, rather than just linguistic or the human exceptionalism, basically. So another important point to consider in posthumanism is some scholars suggest us that we are moving towards a post-Cartesian world, basically. So what does posthumanism, post-Cartesian world mean? Basically, we know that in the rationalist thought, for example, the René Descartes, one of the founders of the modern rationalism, who said that I think, therefore I am. This is where the mind-body duality actually came into being. And since then, we see that human sciences, social sciences, have been influenced by this binary thinkingness. So this binary thinking has been is actually under question today, and posthumanism rejects this dichotomous configuration of the world where we see look at the reality in either and or. We look at the world in terms of the binary, like nature and culture, materiality and discursivity, subject and object, or human and non-human, mind and body. And therefore, I say that we need to look at the world in terms of assemblages and entanglements, where we have this dynamic process of interconnectedness. So similarly, posthumanism also rejects the idea that knowing is a product of the self-contained rational human subject. So thinking is not something which is limited to the humans alone. But today there are studies that suggest that many non-human entities like animals, birds, and plant, for example, they have their own cognitive processes. They have their own thinking processes. So therefore, we don't need to look at the reality of non-human entity as passive and something which is to be exploited by the human beings only. So this is where we have this post-humanist applied linguistics, a very important book written by Alastair Pennycook, where he talks about how posthumanism is currently actually shaping our thoughts in the field of linguistics, basically. And we know that the modern linguistics that we know today, it is influenced by some of the Enlightenment discourses like cognitivism, humanism, and of course this Eurocentric ontologies, and therefore we have the idea of linguistic exceptionalism, which is which is a core core of the modern linguistics. So this idea of linguistic exceptionalism in language is the primary object of study in linguistics. This is actually being questioned in post-human applied linguistics, and we start looking at the communication in a very fluid and dynamic ways, and therefore we focus on place, objects, and semiotics. And this is where you can see in the studies which are related to linguistic landscape, geosemiotics, or nexus analysis. This is where the language and learning, they are considered as emergent, and we have different understanding of the identity and cognition. Rather than like human-centered cognition, we have distributed accounts of identity, distributed accounts of cognition. And likewise today, we have so many theoretical strands that are influenced by posthumanism, and that define language, they define communication in fluid and dynamic ways. For example, look at the word uh, use of translanguaging, for example, how translanguaging helps us redefine communication through very fluid communicative modalities, other than a language as a pre-given, but language is something which is seen as a process, or not as a noun, but as a verb. We do languaging basically, and this languaging, the act of languaging involves not only language, but language is just one means, one element of the entire communication, and we have other semiotic modes that also contribute to meaning-making processes. So basically, posthumanism rejects the ideas of nativism and constructivism on behaviorist assumption that learning occurs as the brain process information. So posthumanism basically supports the idea, which is ecological perspective, and it emphasizes the notion of emergence from a range of interaction that occur in the wider communication. So we have many other theories like the nexus analysis that also focuses on how people, places, discourses, and objects together facilitate action and social change. So if we look at applied linguistics from post-humanist perspective today, then we see language, we see communication, we see our identity, we see our entire social discourses around social change and action. They are transformed today, and they are looked at in terms of assemblages, in terms of fluidity, and in terms of entanglements. So just an idea, we of course need to explore it further, but given the time period, limit of time period, I will just quickly get back to my study. And before that, I must tell you that if somebody is interested to look at the discourses of environment, ecology, and human-nature relationship, then there is a growing scholarship and on ecology, particularly in the field of applied linguistics, this whole. And we have a number of perspectives that actually can help us to understand the representation and of nature and human and the environment. For example, we have ecological citizenship, green applied linguistics, which is influenced by post-humanist thought, and then we have eco-ethical consciousness, eco-pedagogy. Likewise, we have eco-linguistics, or we also call it ecological discourse analysis. And then we have recently eco-linguistic informed critical language awareness, and then we have eco-imagistics. Eco-imagistics definitely looks at not only language, but also different multimodal resources that also contribute to the representation and construction of certain discourses about nature and environment and the human beings. And then we have a language and climate justice. So if you are interested, then you can definitely look at these different theoretical perspectives that can help you to rethink about the nature, rethink about the human, rethink about the physical and material world. So influenced by these particular thoughts, we recently conducted one study in Sindh province of Pakistan. This study was recently published in one journal. And we basically focused on decentering the anthropocentric worldview. Now, anthropocentric worldview means that's a human-centered worldview in the language textbook. So how language textbook basically in Sindh province, Pakistan, they construct human-centered worldview in their through language and through multimodal resources. So what we did basically, we looked at school textbook from a post-humanist perspective, and we tried to understand how school curricula in Sindh province of Pakistan, they represent human and the relationship of a human with the nature and with this physical and material world. So there were two important questions that we actually tried to address. For example, the first research question we focused on, it was how do English language textbooks represent the environment and nature discursively and multimodally. So, of course, when we talk about discourses, then discourses are both, they can be multimodal, they can be something which are influenced by languages. So the second was, how is the relationship between human and nature mediated in the textbooks? So these are two research questions that we basically tried to cover in our study. And our study was broadly influenced by post-humanist thought and also Southern theory, which particularly focuses on the ecological view. And then what we did, we basically tried to analyze 12 English language textbooks, which have been produced by Syntactic Board, Jamshoro. And we used eco-linguistic informed CLA, critical language awareness, and multimodality as theoretical frameworks in our study. Theoretical and analytical framework, because the multimodality is not only theoretical, but also very sophisticated analytical tool that can help us to analyze images. For example, the book written by Leon, Chris and Leon, especially on reading images, that can be really helpful to understand the multimodality and effectively. So I will quickly come to the findings that we actually got from our study. There are different findings, but I will just focus on two important findings very quickly to let you know how the textbook basically represent the discourses of anthropocentrism and how the nature is represented there. For example, we found that English language textbooks in Sindh province, Pakistan, they emphasize anthropocentrism and aestheticization of the nature and the human and non-human dualities. So if I start with the human and non-human dualities, that means that humans are shown as separate from the nature, and human is there only to look at the nature as a source of aesthetic pleasure. Human is there to use the nature a kind of an object to be exploited. For example, you can see here the image of the shoe, for example. The shoe basically symbolizes something else, but we can see here how shoe is displaced on the nature that actually symbolically represents the control over the environment, to control over the nature, and human beings are living inside there. So these kind of discourses are normalized in textbook. Likewise, we can see how in the first picture, for example, early to rise, the boy is shown there who is just standing right at the center of the earth and feels the nature. So nature is shown as an object of as an aesthetic object only. So the reality of nature as its own sentient being, a sentient entity, it is actually being overlooked. Nature has its own reality. But man's relationship with the nature is definitely defined in particular human-centered way. And likewise, we can see here the Daffodil, for example, by William Wordsworth. So Daffodil, where William Wordsworth talks about the beauty of the flower, beauty of the nature. So this is where the scholars basically question how human-centered cognition, human thinks about the nature as an object of study. Human thinks about nature as a resource to be exploited. Human thinks about the nature as a source of aesthetic pleasure only. So that actually ignores the reality or overlooks the reality of the nature as a sentient entity or its own particular reality. So likewise, we will see another important finding in our study. For example, we looked at how different images and different excerpts were actually shown in the textbooks that represent nature in terms of economic benefit, benefit for the human beings. For example, look at these animals. They have been their relationship with the human being has been basically portrayed in terms of consumerism, in terms of the neoliberal discourses. That is, that they are there to be used by human beings for their economic ends. So the relationship between the human and the animal here is very much economic, and this is where the scholars refer to it as the neoliberalization of the environmental discourses, where we don't regard animals as separate entities with their own reality, with their own life, but we use them for our own particular gains. So likewise, another important finding here was about the normalizing unsustainable stories and illusion of emergency. These are two very important findings I would focus here. Look at these two images, for example. This is basically a lesson which is about the floods which came in 2010 in Sindh province. And This lesson is basically about a woman whose house, whose belongings, they were destroyed in floods, basically. But unfortunately, the textbooks in Sindh province, Pakistan, they actually use this title "floods" as a blessing in disguise. So instead of problematizing the discourses of the flood and questioning these climate issues in Pakistan, and why do actually the floods come. What textbook does is actually the textbook tries to normalize this unsustainable story by representing a woman who is actually supported by an NGO to rebuild her house, and then the NGO basically supports the women to start a business, a poultry farm, and this is where she starts earning and she makes money for her living. So this is actually where the textbook talks about the normalization of unsustainable story in a way that uh, instead of questioning the real conditions which are responsible for the advent of this flood and all the climate issues, the NGO has been shown to support the women and to start a business, and then she actually finds flood as a blessing for her. So this is quite ridiculous in a sense that these textbooks are basically normalizing these stories. And likewise, if we look at the other story here, for example, one of the lessons in grade 11 that refers to the nature, for example, and there are two students who are talking about the pollution and the climate issues in the nature. And for example, two students are talking about the Akash is saying the air is getting polluted day by day, and then nature and environment are facing a threat. So what Dhati is saying, that is awful. How is the, he questioned basically, he asked a question, how is the air getting polluted? So Akash basically replies that humans are polluting the air with leaving smoke of millions of vehicles, mills, factories, and cutting down trees. So this is very important here. Interesting, like humans are polluting the air. So this is where, like in discourse studies, we learn about how language but is used to elide or omit or delete the agency of actually the main agents who are involved in certain action. For example, when we talk about the humans are polluting air, then the scholars refer to the role of like governments and the IMF and the multinational corporations who are basically involved in this destruction of the environment, destruction of the climate. So these are rather replaced with the humans as a very neutral term and neutral. So textbook discourses are basically neutralized in a way that the learner's consciousness around climate issues is actually uh, is portrayed in terms of a self-responsibilization and individualization rather than looking politically or looking critically who is actually involved in these discourses. So, of course, there are more findings to study, but because of the time frame, I need to stop here just to give you a conclusion and the way forward. So basically, if we look at the textbook discourses from eco-CLA perspective, then we can argue that textbooks basically do not promote localized sustainable thinking among students, and they fail to connect learning to real ecological challenges and conditions of learners and non-human entities in the particular geographic context in. And it's not only done through discourses based on languages, but we also see there are various semiotic modes are co-deployed in textbooks to normalize unsustainable stories. By semiotic modes, I mean there are certain images which are also used along with the language. And then we consider anthropocentrism to be a core issue in textbook writing in Pakistan. So anthropocentrism, the human-centeredness, and that promotes other related ideologies and discourses like neoliberalism and then aestheticization and then human-centered cognition, because human views nature in terms of human consider nature an object of study only. And therefore, we basically call for discursive reparations. We scholars have actually suggested to think in terms of reparations. So we have to think in terms of epistemic reparations and pedagogical reparations. We have to basically amend the harms that we have done to the school curricula and by promoting such kind of ideologies and discourses where we try to create dichotomies between the human and the non-human world, where non-human world is in the service of the human human being. So we basically propose that the discourses need to be disrupted within a historical perspective of the Eurocentric Enlightenment as well as the contemporary neoliberal hegemony. So, of course, our thinking about the environment, about the nature, about the languages, about the curricula policy, they are highly influenced by colonial ideology and Eurocentrism and definitely the neoliberal hegemony today. So that needs to be dismantled, that needs to be re-questioned, and we need to look at the curricula from an ecological perspective in order to promote this embodied thinking. And we also, lastly, we also think along with, in line with the UNESCO's new social contract for education. For example, UNESCO's new contract in 2021 that proposes that actually recognizes the colonial and industrial legacies that have disrupted the harmonious relationship between the human and more than human species. And therefore, UNESCO's new social contract called for the reparations, it called for the developing a curricula which can save the damaged planet. And for that, it promotes, for example, it advocates the green economies and eco-entrepreneurship, green skills, and the carbon neutral futures. This is where I think it's a lesson for the textbook writers and the textbook board, especially to rethink the textbook writing in terms of ecological perspective. And if you're interested, you can definitely read this whole paper that can help you to understand our findings and our perspective from the post-humanist perspective to look at the school curricula. And at the end, in the end, if you have any question, then you can write to me and about if you have any comments or if you have any questions, you can just use that email to ask me and send me questions, and I will be happy to reply. And thank you very much. And please feel free to download this article. And if you don't, then you can write to me. I can share this complete draft with you for reading. Thank you so much.